See you, Andrew.
Welcome everyone to the afternoon session of this workshop looking at the Scottish Island Futures 2050 and beyond, focusing on language, culture, heritage and the creative industries. And we had a great session this morning, some good discussion, and we were sort of identifying problems and challenges, such like ageing population in the islands, the economic problems faced by people trying to buy houses, failure of government strategy towards the languages, the impact, both positive and negative, of incomers coming into communities without the languages, but still with an interest in the culture, but it obviously has an effect. A decrease in intergenerational transmission of languages and culture, and possibly as few as 15,000 Gaelic speakers habitually using the language in the Western Isles, and we haven't done the same piece of research in the Northern Isles, so we don't know how many people are using Shetland or the Orkney dialect. But nonetheless, these are challenges, and there were some suggestions about where we might want to take the discussion in the afternoon. So these have come out of research that some of it has come out of research that Crocker has done into the Gaelic situation. So he made a very good case for focusing on language protection instead of language promotion. We might want to get into that in a little bit more detail in our discussions. And also a recognition that there are new social and economic realities in the islands. It's not the 1950s, and it's definitely not going to be the 2020s in 2050. There are going to be changes, and they're happening at the moment, so we have to be aware of that. And there's also going to be an increasing use of technology like we're doing at the moment. What sort of impact is that going to have, both on language use and creative practice? But there was also some interesting comments about the importance of not just the language, but the heritage, the dúlchas, the ICH, the intangible cultural heritage, and how that's very important for community vibrancy. So we've identified challenges, and we've started to suggest where we might like to take the discussion in the afternoon. And to kick us off, to get us thinking useful thoughts, we're going to have a number of short talks. And also, to start with, we're going to have a short film by Rebecca Rennell and Emily Gall, who unfortunately can't be here today because they're busy setting up an exhibition in Taikyorsabach, I believe. But their film will show us some very good example of some of the intersection of creativity and heritage work that they're doing. And to finish off in the afternoon, we've got Frank Rennie here, who will show his film Shenachlis, and he'll be available for a question and answer session afterwards as well. So we will have talks, we'll have discussion, and we'll have some video to watch as well. So just to start us off, I've also got the Slido working here. Now let's just see. Which you should be able to access via WebEx. And it would be very interesting to know where everyone is coming to us from. So I'll open that, and please feel free to tell us where you're based. And if you have questions and ideas, stick them in the chat. I can't see the chat because of the way this system works, but luckily I've got Simon Clark here beside me, who I'm sure will keep me informed about questions that are appearing. Okay, so I believe Leanne has the short film from Rebecca there. So maybe Leanne, if you could show it. It's just a short but interesting film.
Poster.
Should come up.
Should come up. So yeah, perfect. It should. go inside.
What you'll see is a real life-size reconstruction of a Viking longhouse. You know about the Vikings?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? So when you put that on, you'll step back in time 1,000 years and you'll walk through the Viking longhouse.
Oh, that's it over already. Well, there we go. That's just a little taster of the interesting work that Rebecca and Emily are doing using virtual reality and augmented reality as well, because you can actually go to the place and use the app to see the results. And this could be a very interesting avenue to follow in our discussions. The impact. Yes, yes.
Leanne has her hand up.
Oh, Leanne.
Being polite here, but you're not actually sharing your Slido yet.
Oh, okay. Well, right. Why is that then? It says I am.
Would you like me to bring these attendees in so that we can hear and see them and they can join in the conversation?
Yes, that would be grand. Okay, I must have to open Slido again then, just to make it work. Right, while I'm fiddling about with this, it would be interesting if we could bring into the discussion the impact that the new technologies that we have at the moment and their development, their developed forms might have on language and heritage by 2050. Okay. They pose challenges, of course, but they could be part of the answer for creating vibrant communities. So I will try that now. Let's see if this works. Leanne, stick it on. Is that coming up? Well, I don't know if it's working or not. Just stick in the chat where you are. That would be the easiest thing. And we'll look at that later on. Okay, well, hopefully that little film has got you intrigued, and I would recommend watching the much longer film that Rebecca and Emily have online, and making the trip to the US to actually use the system. One of the great advantages they've decided is that it only works on the island. So you can't sort of download it and use it and benefit from it unless you're there. So that seems like a particularly good idea for those who are wanting to use augmented reality for sites. So it just enhances what's already there, but you can't use it elsewhere. So very, it's tourism. Okay, now we'll start with our short talks then. Simon.
Okay, it's over to me. Right. Successfully sharing a slide. Okay. Hoping that's sharing at your end.
And it's sharing my Slido as well. There's a mystery.
Andrew, it's sharing my Slido.
Sharing.
Okay, that's kind of weird. Okay, never mind. Let's keep going. Okay. Right, in that case, so what I want to talk about really is the future of the past, a bit of a pretentious title. Archaeology obviously is in the past, but heritage is really about the present and the future. And what I wanted to just emphasize in this session was, I can get to move on, is how we have different uses for heritage. Actually, there's different audiences and very definitely different uses for heritage. They're not necessarily diametrically opposed to each other, but they're not automatically aligned either. So I wanted to look just at the site of Scatness in Shetland, which is a project I had the privilege to take part in. And before I badmouth everybody, can I say that many of these mistakes are essentially mistakes that I am co-author of. But it's an interesting project because it was a collaboration between a research institution, Bradford University Archaeological Sciences Department, and the Shetland Amenity Trust. So there's a coalition of people that were involved in bringing this project forward. It operated for about 10 years, from about 1996 to about 2006 for the excavation phase, and in many ways it was a very successful project. It's been fully published, and it was a wonderful visitor experience for those people that saw it when it was under excavation. It was one of the biggest research excavations in Scotland at its time. It had up to sort of 60 or 70 people excavating on the site, and during an excavation season we would typically have 5,000 to 8,000 visitors coming from the general public to come and visit it. But one of the things that, on reflection, I can see happened is we didn't quite get the balance between the different drivers right and the timing of things that we did right, really. So on the academic side, even the academic institution actually had a number of different outcomes that it was looking for. It was both a training excavation and it was also a research project. And anybody that's actually worked with undergraduate students know that you don't necessarily get the best research outcome from giving everybody a go. So there is a play-off there between participation and certainly the speed with which you excavate, but also to some extent the competence with which you excavate as well. So there's a real interesting issue there. And there was a very interesting tension which has not been widely publicized, but actually between incomers. Almost all the undergraduates were incomers to the region. There was a small group from UHI, but the vast majority were from metropolitan Britain, many from England, in actual fact. Try not to spit as you say that. And there were local participants that were just volunteers, but they were kind of second-class participants in a sense. They were very much looked down upon by the undergraduates. So there's a little bit of a town and gown thing going on there, which is just worth mentioning. The main tension, though, in many respects, was between the learning outcomes and the research outcomes of the institution and the public engagement and educational objectives of the Shetland Amenity Trust. So they, as I say, both sides, did their best, and I think, credit to Bradford University. They acquiesced in having a large effort put into the presentation to the general public. A big educational effort. They were spending tens of thousands of pounds actually on presentation to the public during the excavation seasons. They had a live history team that was working with, getting kids to dress up as Vikings and doing craft activities and things like that. So it was it was well done in a lot of respects. It actually won a prize from Virgin Travel as one of the best visitor attractions in Britain one year. So it did achieve in a lot of respects. But there is this tension between research archaeology and presentation of archaeology. When you excavate something, you destroy it. And so this illustrates this very nicely here. This is the Broch itself, and inside the Broch we have a wheelhouse, or sorry, a Pictish. Well, there's a wheelhouse, and then there's a Pictish cellular structure inside that. And this was kind of unexpected, although we should have anticipated it perhaps, but it was regarded as of such high quality for the Pictish period that Historic Scotland didn't want to see it destroyed and excavated away. So we actually didn't achieve one of our primary research goals of excavating the primary floor surfaces and occupation deposits of the Broch interior itself. So you sacrificed something of your research outcomes for a longer term presentational outcome. There was also a tension between excavation and presentation to the public. We took the covers off to excavate during the excavation season. At the end of the season, we put the covers back on and weighted them down with old tyres and fishnets and things like that. So it was only available during the excavations for a very small part of the year, just about 2 months of the 12 months of the year. So there were some pole soles that would turn up, and we would just be pulling the covers on, and it was all gone. So this fantastic tourist and educational resources covered up every year. Absolutely necessary to protect the archaeology before it was consolidated, because it was an active excavation still. But obviously there's a tension in that. We could have conceivably could have left it open, but it would have been a cost to doing that. In the longer term, the site was consolidated, but it wasn't consolidated as we went along. And in retrospect, I think that was a gigantic mistake. I think we should have pressed ahead and excavated much faster in limited parts of the site, consolidated them, and then moved on to another part of the site. What we tried to do was we actually had three excavation projects with no consolidation in a row, each of 3 years, and then we tried to have a consolidation project at the end of that. And it didn't really work. We left ourselves too much to do at the end. And also we didn't have an ongoing resource at the end of each excavation season while the project was going on that could have been shown to the general public. So really what I'm trying to say is that excavation and presentation to the public is a compromise. And I think, you know, everybody went into this with good intentions. I'm not saying they didn't, but the priorities could have been rearranged, and actually we could all probably have got something better out of the experience. The big problem with the site is actually about the immediate gratification showing it to the general public and getting excavation results, and the longer term consolidation. Some important features of the site have still not been consolidated. So the main entrance into the Broch, for example, this is the state of the site in 2019. It hasn't moved on obviously during the pandemic either. We've run out of funds now. It's now a weathering site, but it's not a site that we're actually getting any real interpretive value out of. It's a bit of a state. Important parts of the site are actually not presented at all. The site is actually a Broch village surrounded by an enormous ditch, 8 meters wide, 3 meters deep, with a 3 meter high rampart inside that as well. And there's no attempt to interpret that to the general public at all, which changes its meaning quite considerably. I think it's perfectly legitimate that only a small part of that ditch was excavated. But if we'd excavated with a thought to how are we going to consolidate this, we'd have chosen a different section to excavate. There's actually a cutting through the site that was created in 1976 by the cutting of an airport access road. We could have put the section across the ditch at that point, and it would have been relatively easy to consolidate that and interpret it to the general public. So we didn't think ahead. We didn't think ahead a decade to what's the end game here. And that's in spite of the fact that we had long-term funding from Historic Scotland to actually undertake this project. So we can't blame them on this occasion. And as I say, we also aimed very high, or the Shetland Amenity Trust aimed very high. It was always next year that we were going to get this big windfall funding to do long-term consolidation and presentation to the public. So we have a shed at the site. We've got large parts of the site not consolidated, and they failed in their bid to get an enormous amount of money, just under £8 million, for an enclosed exhibition space for the consolidated site. So I thought this project was mad anyway. I think what's wonderful about Brochs is their location in the landscape. So putting them inside a big shed is not actually, in my view, the best way forward. But the other thing about it is about the allocation of scarce resources. The number of visitors that this site gets, in my view, was never likely to attract £8 million worth of funding. To put it into some sort of context, if we think about the amount of money that is spent at somewhere like Stonehenge or Tintagel, a £25 million project and a £5 million project, respectively, the numbers of people that they're getting at that site mean that it's essentially a £20 investment per annual visitor. It's more like a £1,000 investment for each annual visitor at somewhere like Scatness. So we need to think not just about how we manage the resource in terms of the non-renewable archaeological resource, but also in terms of, you know, what's a reasonable bang for your buck, given the number of people that are going to visit the site. You know, if it's going to have £1 million, a million visitors a year, you can, you know, plan for the Hanging Gardens of Babylon or whatever. If it's, if it's a relatively modest number of people in the islands, you need to aim lower. You need to use maybe things like the virtual reality interpretations that Rebecca was showing us in that previous video. So just to conclude, the main points really I want to make are that archaeological monuments are an asset, but they're also a liability and a responsibility when you expose them. If you want to keep archaeology safe, basically keep it buried. If you've exposed it through archaeology, unless you've got some good plan for presenting to the public, it actually should be reburied again. But that obviously takes it out of circulation for interpretation to the general public. So archaeological cultural resource management is a compromise between competing objectives and stakeholder groups. There isn't a right answer for this, but there are definitely wronger answers that are out there and available. It is, the exact balance is going to be a personal perspective to some extent. Academics are going to inevitably be more interested in the research and the teaching agenda. Local agencies are going to be more interested in creating amenities, but even within that, you need to think about whether you're creating amenities for mass tourism or for educational purposes and local identity. So lots of things to think about there in terms of what is heritage for. And it's not about the past, actually, it's about how we manage a resource going forward. And as I say, we've got this tension between how do we use it now and how much of it do we consume going, and how much do we keep for the future as well. So it's all about the balance between costs of various types and potential returns. And I'll stop it at that. Hopefully that wasn't too long.
No, not at all. Thank you very much, Simon. What's your sort of feeling when you see Scatness at the moment, when we were going down to the airport?
Frustration, a little bit of guilt that although I am one of those quite vocal people that lashes out in all directions, so I will have criticised the decisions that were made. I was only a very small cog in a much bigger project. I was a supervisor. I wasn't even part of the directorial team. But not all of these problems that I'm talking about with Perfect 2020 vision now were things which I identified at the time. I think everybody went into this with good intentions. Well, pretty much everybody. There was a certain amount of megalomania in aiming for £8 million, which I think can legitimately be criticised. But I think the research academics actually were laudable in the balance that they gave to local voice and to interpretation to the wider public. They weren't just focused on their research outputs. The Amenity Trust, did work constructively with the best academics, not just Bradford University actually, but also Stirling and various other places, and with UHI in terms of facilitating an opportunity. It's one of those things, but hopefully we could do it better if we were to do it again. And I think this planning for long-term future of what you're planning to do with the site interpretively is really important, not just hoping for the best that some massive windfall will come to dig you out of a presentational hole at the end of the project.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll bear those thoughts in mind for our discussion. And next we have Lynn. Hello, Lynn.
Hello. Yes. I hadn't actually prepared anything really, and when I opened, I should have opened the agenda before this morning. And then Simon started the presentation. I thought, oh, I suppose I'd better pull something out. So here's one I prepared earlier. Just a bit of a background on why I can just pull this out of the bag is because as well as actually working with Andrew in the Institute for Northern Studies, I'm part of the department. I am in Orkney. I run the undergraduate provision. I run the culture and heritage degree. I very much have an interest in the culture and heritage. But I'm also a tour guide for Orkney. I'm also a tour guide trainer. I'm also on the secretary of the museum, the Stromness Museum, and secretary of the Orkney Heritage Society. So I have feet. I have so many feet in so many camps. And so I want to protect Orkney's heritage. I want to protect Orkney's culture. I want to promote it. but I need to protect it as well. And I do get quite excited about things, sometimes a bit overly excited about some things. So sometimes I need to be reined in. And I've changed my locations. I'm no longer in the same building as another member of staff. So I'm being infested by cats. So apologies if you see a tail going past. Obviously the Orkney flag. Now that was a big bone of contention because we had a different flag. We used to have a yellow flag with a red cross on it. And the Lord Lion, the man in charge of flags, one day said, nope, you can't have that. So this was the winner of a competition, and it was a postman in Bursey that actually did this. And it uses all the culture that we have and all the heritage that we have, and the way that we can describe it is that the blue is the Scottish saltire. The yellow comes from the lion rampant. The red is very much the colour of Orkney's sporting endeavours, and of course it's the Nordic cross, so it's off-centre. Now, because I originally put this presentation together for giving a cruise ship talk on board a cruise ship, because I'm a tour guide trainer, so I get asked to do things just to talk about our cruise. And actually, something I meant to say, Simon, about you're talking about Scotness and the fact that it was a tourism product for a very short period of time. Well, we have exactly the same in Orkney. We've got the Ness of Brodgar, which is a massive, major Neolithic site. Just won at the weekend Tourism Award for the best tourism provision in Orkney. So it is possible, and it's only uncovered for 6 or 7 weeks in every year. But we in Orkney, we are the cruise destination port of Britain. We're number one. We've got over 220 cruise ships booked for 2023, which is filling people with equal amounts of horror and glee. Because there are always going to be detractors of everything that you try to do, and we do tend to attract bigger cruise ships coming in. You can see that's a kind of a medium-sized one actually there at Hatston. But we get the massive ones. We actually had the 4th biggest cruise ship in the world before the pandemic. So we can accommodate them because we've got the deepest, the longest deep water port berth rather in Scotland, so we can attract them. And the reason that they come to Orkney is because of our culture and our heritage. It's really nice to also see some ships going into Stromness, which is our second town. Now, the culture and heritage of Orkney, of course, there's really, if you look at anything to do with Orkney, we really only have 2 things going for us, apparently, and that is our Viking legacy and our Neolithic legacy. But there's a whole lot more to us than that. Of course, their Viking cathedral here, St Magnus Cathedral, founded in 1137. I can tell you all the tour guiding stuff all about it. Built red sandstone and yellow sandstone, comes from... Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. But the cathedral is very much a focus of people in Orkney as much as it is a focus for the visitors coming to Orkney. And being part of the Orkney Heritage Society, we are actually going to be involved in a couple of projects, community projects coming up, looking at the community usage of the cathedral. And it's so good to see that this big, vast, historic, beautiful building is as equally loved by the local population, and not necessarily the people who go to church, but everybody has an ownership of the cathedral, which is a good thing to see. And then, of course, we've got our Neolithic history, because that's all we've got in Orkney is Vikings and stones. The Standing Stones of Stennis, of course, is part of our World Heritage Site. The other part is, oh, that's another picture of the Standing Stones. The reason I think put that photo in is because we get people who come to visit off a cruise ship, and they've got different interests. Some of them will come specifically for the really ancient heritage and history. The fact that we've got probably the Standing Stones of Stennis is probably the oldest stone circle in the UK, 3100 BC. But equally, there will be people who come off to look at the sheep. And this last year in 2022, we had a unicorn sheep. Literally, there was a sheep that had a horn growing out of its forehead. So yeah, that was another USP for Orkney, a unicorn. But we've got the Ring of Brodgar as well. So there are 4 distinct monuments as part of our World Heritage Site, but they are distinct monuments in their own right. And of course, this is now a historic photo, because Historic Environment Scotland, who look after our sites in Orkney, we have no National Trust for Scotland in Orkney, they've actually closed off the ring, so you can no longer go into the centre, into the stones themselves. And it's all to do with protecting the path around the stones. There's probably more to it than that. I think it's entirely fiscal, but this is the root of all evil, so I'm not going to complain about that because there's no point. And that's just a nice aerial shot of the Ring of Brodgar, where it sits. And in between the standing stones and the Ring of Brodgar is the Ness of Brodgar that I just spoke about, which has been under excavation now for nearly 15 years. And they win all the awards going because it's the most amazing, stunning site. And then we've got Scarabray, which is a Neolithic village, and it's a pretty stunning place to go and visit. And it's Orkney's most visited paid site, in collaboration with Scale House, which is a 17th century mansion house. So you go to see Neolithic, so you go to see, I'm not going to do it, but I quite often when I'm guiding, I'll count on my fingers 15 times, very old. And then you come to this and it's like very, very old. Because there's just such a vast difference in the ages of the things that you can come in to see here in Orkney. And Scale House is a mansion house that has, well, the good graces of actually owning the land upon which Scarabray sits, which is why it's part of the ticket. It's all part of a marketing thing. But they have their own heritage because, of course, a landowning class has got their own very distinct heritage and history in Orkney. And Scale House also, they did an exhibition last year where we had links with Japan. So we sometimes kind of forget that island groups can have vast linkages across the world. And something that we say about Orcadians is you will find an Orcadian in every single corner of the world, because over the years we have explored it all. We do have wartime history as well, quite a big wartime history, and we had a vast influx of service personnel to Orkney during both World Wars. And actually, something that is very little known is that Orkney gave a brand new word in English. If you've ever thought about, right, it's time to go, it's time to scarper, well, that came from Scapa Flow, and it is a kind of a Cockneyfied version of coming to Scapa. But the problem is that the English, they can't speak properly. And instead of saying Scapa, they say Scarpar. And they put in all these R's. And so it kind of joined the lexicon of English to leave us to Scarpar. And it comes from Scapa Flow, which of course comes from Old Norse. That's just another view of the Churchill Barrier, so called because it was Winston Churchill himself who came to Orkney and he gave the nod. These barriers need to be built, close off the defences into Scapa during the World Wars, Second World War, because we were the base for the British Home Fleet. And of course, the German Home Fleet, they scuttled themselves here in Orkney in the First World War. So we've got lots of interesting World War history as well. And we've got the Italian chapel. So called because it was built by Italian prisoners of war who were drafted into Orkney to help build those barriers. And it's something which is very much a part of the tourist product today, that you'll see thousands and thousands of people going to visit the Italian chapel. A very recent bit of Orkney's history, but it was the busiest site in Orkney to visit until they had to instigate an entry fee, but it's still up there as one of the most important places to go and see. It's a very minor entry fee. It's not really putting people off going to visit it. And of course, this is a rather nice photo of the Northern Lights. This last week over Britain, they've been going, oh, look at the Northern Lights, aren't they marvellous? And then everybody in Orkney and Shetland's going, oh yeah, it's the Northern Lights. Yeah, I saw them last week and the week before and the week before that. Another bit of our wartime heritage. The monument that you can see on the cliff is actually the Kitchener Memorial. Now, as part of the Orkney Heritage Society, we kind of were of the opinion that the Kitchener Memorial needed to commemorate more than just Lord Kitchener that was lost on the HMS Hampshire on the 6th of June 1916, because there were a whole pile of other people on board there too. So we actually fundraised and we built a wall which goes in a semicircular base around the bottom of the monument. This photo predates it. I don't think you would see it. It's the angle is wrong. And then the names of every single man that was on that ship and the ship which went down the week after, the Laurel Crown, were inscribed in this wall. So it's no longer the Kitchener Memorial, it's the Hampshire Memorial. But unfortunately, memories are long. People still call it the Kitchener Memorial. And then we've got our natural heritage. We've got some rather stunning views. This, of course, is the Old Man Ahoy, which is a stone stack, a old red sandstone stone stack which sits apart from our second biggest island of Hoy. And its claim to fame was that it was the very first BBC outside broadcast in the 1960s when Chris Bonington climbed it. Very first time that the BBC had ever done a live broadcast outside. And Chris Bonington actually returned to Orkney when he was 80 and climbed it again. And it takes me all my time to climb my stairs. Stromness, of course, I did this for cruise ships or cruise ship passengers, so I was just kind of going, isn't Orkney bonny? And of course, this is just a nice view across Stromness, in fact, looking across at the Holmes, which are the two inner islands, and in the distance, you can actually see more of the mainland. Now, I disappeared from the screen just for a brief moment there when Simon was talking, because I had a quick look at this and I thought, there's a puffin, and I thought, oh, what's the Arcadian dialect for a puffin? And I thought this was just so very pertinent that I am what is called chanting to you right now. Because if I spoke in Arcadian, there's only about 6 folk in the room that would understand. So I speak properly. And I thought, I have called a puffin for so long. What on earth is its Orkney dialect name? So I had to look up one of my books, and written by an Englishman, and it's a Tammy Nori. And I thought, oh, of course it is, how could I forget that? But the very fact that I have Orkney's culture and heritage kind of at the forefront of my mind, and I'd forgotten that, and I thought, that's poor. So I was rather disenchanted with myself. We produce very high quality food. All of our meat is grass reared. We've got fantastic seafood coming out of our very pristine waters. In my other life, I have another job somewhere else. I actually work for SEPA, which is the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and we are the ones that have an overview of Orkney, of Scotland's environment. Oh, it's in the title. And I was really quite surprised. In fact, I was shocked before the pandemic that one of our officers said that there were large volumes of microplastics on Orkney's shoreline. And I thought, that's not possible. Our water is lovely and beautiful and clear, but of course we don't live in a vacuum. We are, we're importing everybody else's pollution. So unfortunately, it's something that we cannot escape from. Our jewellery in Orkney is an exceptionally strong market. In fact, the culture, the heritage, the history, we draw upon it a lot in the art and design of Orkney. In fact, I'm wearing 2 runic rings myself today. Alison Moore, I just chose her because she's one of the smaller producers, but even she's quite large, a huge enterprise these days. We produce lots of refreshing things to drink. Just 2 whisky distilleries. We've got 2 whisky distilleries, we've got 4 gin distilleries, 2 breweries, a winery. We've got somebody who makes craft vinegar, not quite so interesting to drink, lovely milk, and good clean fresh water, which has been through the water treatment works. Oh, more whisky. Now this is something I kind of alluded to in, I'm not sure if it was in this morning session or in a breakout session, the bar. Now the bar is it's a football game without any rules that happens on Christmas Day and New Year's Day every year. And our local newspaper perpetuate the apologetic apostrophe, which drives me absolutely mad. BA apostrophe equals baw. And I tried to explain this on their local social media, which was just a really stupid idea, because even the local newspaper came back to say, well, we're just continuing with the news reporting that we've always done. Here's a news report from the 1920s where we talk about the Kirkwall Baw. I'm like, oh no. We've got lots of culture that we draw upon, making things from straw or stray, because we're a treeless group of islands. So originally the Orkney chair would have been made of 100% straw. But now it's imported wood, obviously, nice oaks and things coming from all over the world. But it's locally grown straw barks. The more recent ones have got straw seats. They used to be much more Presbyterian, nice hard wooden seat to sit on too. You sit up straight. The thing that is really, I think, getting kind of right now, certainly in the local media, is the problems surrounding our transport to and from Orkney, because we have got this ferry, the Vargan. She's one of a fleet run by Orkney Ferries. They are pretty ancient now. They're coming on 30, 40 years old. They are inefficient, they're costly. And there is a kind of ongoing argument that the Scottish Government should provide them because the Western Isles are completely provided for. Why isn't Orkney provided for? And I kind of tend to agree that we shouldn't have to be replacing these ferries, which are going to cost something like 800 million each or something ridiculous. You know, it's more money than an island group can possibly come up with, and we must do something about our ferries. And it's at the very much at the forefront of folks' minds. We have got the shortest scheduled flight in the world between two of our islands, Westray and Papa Westray. The main ferry company is Northlink, which operates to Shetland as well. They have some government subsidies, but we've got another ferry company which operates between Orkney and the mainland, and it's completely locally owned, no subsidies whatsoever, brand new ship. I can't tell you her capacity, but she's pretty massive, and she's a catamaran, and she's got cheaper ferry fares than the government subsidised Northlink. So it does make people kind of raise eyebrows and things. So that is my, yes, that's my presentation, which I wasn't going to have given. And so, yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Lynn. No, that was great. Very comprehensive overview of everything that Orkney has to offer by way of heritage and culture. And it's really interesting that you've got, as you say, so many feet and so many pies. Is that how feet and pies? No, that's not right. But anyway, thank you very much for that. And I'm sure we'll pick up on some of the individual cultural attractions or interests that you were mentioning there. So thank you very much indeed. And that takes us on now to Kirsty.
Hello. I hope you can hear me okay. My earphones kind of just ran out of charge. So I haven't prepared a presentation, as it were, and as Simon and Lynn were speaking, I was like, oh, I could say that, I could say this, because I've been involved in like amateur archaeology. I was trained up by SCAPE, and then I worked as a community engagement officer for Scotland's Rural Past project, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I'm going to tell you a bit about myself, and I'm going to focus more on the Gaelic language, heritage and culture side of things. So tell you a bit about myself. Grew up in North Uist. My dad's side, all the way back as far as we can go from Uist. My mum moved to Uist as a hippie in her 20s, teacher hippie coming up, married the crofter who was my dad. She learnt Gaelic and spoke it to us, thankfully. But I always felt a bit like a half-bred when I was younger, so I wasn't very confident in speaking. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I am fluent, I was fluent, and that's all fine. I went on to study at Solmarostig for a year, and then went and did my degree at the School of Scottish Studies in Edinburgh, where I just was completely overwhelmed by the pride it instilled in me, hearing all the recordings that had been made, many by one of my uncles who was a field worker for them. After I graduated, I worked on the Topran Dwolchishire Kisteriches project, and I was overseeing the cataloguing of the entire project. So I had cataloguers working from Shetland to the borders, west to east, and I got very familiar with the folklore of the whole of Scotland, and familiar with like all the different dialects and all the nuances, and so on and so forth. Went on to, I'd moved back to Uist after graduating from Edinburgh University for 10 years. And then I moved back to Edinburgh, and I went into working in the public sector. So as I mentioned, I first of all worked at Arcams, which was the Royal Commission on ancient and historic monuments for Scotland, and then worked for Historic Scotland as their first Gaelic language officer, and I created their first Gaelic language plan and implemented it, which was quite a daunting thing to do, because as I discovered when I joined the organisation, which employs about 1,500 people, there was only me, there was someone who worked at Arnold Blackhouse, and another woman who worked in the grants team. There were 3 of us who spoke Gaelic, and seemingly nobody else. So that was quite a a learning curve for me. Latterly, I moved on then to work as a cultural significance advisor, which meant in practice that I was looking at the ICH, or intangible cultural heritage, of all the properties in care in Scotland, and I was revising and adding to the statements of cultural significance for those. Went on to Creative Scotland, and then became, the last couple of years I've been freelance. And as Keith mentioned in the session this morning, last year I along with Andy McKinnon at Tyhersva, co-directed a feature-length documentary film called Dúchas. Now, Dúchas is a word that doesn't have a direct translation into English. I would say that possibly, on reflection, having done the film and many screenings, that possibly the closest concept to Dúchas is perhaps indigeneity. Keith touched on the fact that Dúchas kind of looks back the way, and we set out to look at why people had to leave the islands historically, the Western Isles historically, and the different reasons why people had to leave, and what that meant for the language and the culture. And in my opinion, I think that in order to figure out where we need to go and how we need to move forward, we need to understand where we've been, what we've come from, and what the journey has been to get to where we are now, so that we can kind of look at that and be able to make an informed plan moving forward. While I worked at Creative Scotland briefly, I had the privilege of working with various people from First Nations people from Turtle Island. And I was fascinated by the fact that many of them couldn't speak their indigenous languages. However, they still had this deep, deep connection to their land and their culture, and that was still being transmitted down through the generations without the language. So I think for me, perhaps the essential thing, is valuing our cultural kind of heritage and our folklore and our connection to the land, because one thing that we do not want to do in the Western Isles, I think, and this is just all my personal opinion as a freelancer, but what I'm really concerned about actually is we don't want to alienate what I would say are the indigenous people of Uist, so people who've been there for centuries, but who don't speak the language anymore, They feel the connection every bit as much as Gaelic speakers do to the land, and they feel the connection, and they have the cultural heritage just as strongly as the people who do speak the language. So I think that's something that's really important to bear in mind when we're having these discussions about Gaelic in particular. There's also been there was discussion in the morning session about people who've come into the islands. And again, these are huge topics, and I'm trying to fire through them quickly because we've got a lot to get through, and this is just a brief little overview and a few of my opinions. I think without many of the people who've come into the islands, a lot of the enterprises that are going on in terms of economics might not have happened. But often some of them, when they come to live in the Western Isles, they're completely unaware that they're moving to a place that 50, 60 years ago was pretty much entirely Gaelic speaking, that if they had moved here, then they would have been very much in the minority by being monolingual. Whereas now they can move up, and many of them don't learn Gaelic, aren't really interested in it. For them, it's either they're artists, they're interested in the landscape or whatever it painting or whatever it may be. So how do we encourage people who come in to engage with the language and the heritage? So moving on to things that I think would help. I mentioned this in the morning as well, that I think one thing that's missing is intergenerational transmission. And of course, you know, things have changed a lot. And as somebody, perhaps it was Simon, who said that, you know, we don't have intergenerational living anymore. You know, like my dad grew up with his granny in the house, you know, so my dad, who's 83, learned all of his oral history from his granny, who was born like, you know, in the 19th century. So that's what I'm currently trying to harness as much as I can of. An example that's come up recently is this idea of, you know, that the old tradition of these stone lifting, heavy stone lifting. So they were called ultach. And a discussion came up, somebody posted online on the North US page, does anybody know about these? And of course, my dad is usually the first one to, despite he's 83, but he's addicted to Facebook. He's incredibly nosy and likes to know what's going on with everybody. So he immediately replied, oh yeah, there was this one, you know, Ultach Ellen Rudd was a person who lived in the house that my family live in and have lived in. And he said that the people who were building the road to Lochmaddy just destroyed it when they were building the road because they had no idea of its cultural significance. So it's gone. But he mentioned another one called Ultach Ilispik Ellen Heisker. Now, Ellen Heisker was my great-great-grandfather, so that would have been my great uncle, would have been Ilispik Ellen Heisker. So this stone was named after my great uncle, and he knows exactly where that is. I do not know exactly where that is. So one of the first things I'm going to do in a couple of weeks when I go home is say to Dad, right, Dad, can you take me to Ultach Ilispik Ellen Heiske? Because, you know, if I don't figure out where that is, then probably he's one of the oldest people in the township, so probably nobody else knows where it is. So if I don't go and say to him, take me there now, show me where it is, then it's gone. And that's just an example of how fragile our heritage is. So I'm trying to rattle through this quite quickly because I'm aware of time. I think aside from, you know, there's all these issues. There's climate change, housing, economic threats, you know, all these things. But thinking about the language and our heritage, for me, I think the key is to somehow instill a sense of pride of place in our younger generation. And now I'm going to say something that's potentially very controversial. So brace yourselves. But I think personally, and this is, you know, having worked in public bodies and in language planning and, you know, also working at the community level, it occurs to me that perhaps instead of, you know, national policies such as, you know, the Gaelic language plans, which are desperately, you know, using this terminology of trying to normalize Gaelic, you know, trying to normalize it and incorporate it into everyday things and, you know, make it normal and etc., etc. How about, you know, perhaps we need to be teaching our children actually how precious and precarious their heritage, culture, and language is. And therefore, perhaps by doing that, we would instill a sense of pride and teach them that they're the torchbearers for future generations if we want these things to survive. So I'll stop there. That was just a rattle through and a few thoughts. Sorry if it was a ramble, but I was just trying to get through it quickly because I'm aware of our time restrictions. So thank you.
That was certainly not a ramble. Thank you very much indeed. That was brilliant. Addressed so many of the topics we've been discussing. It was great to get your overview. You've been doing so many different things and so many sort of cultural heritage and linguistic based activities. And yet you didn't mention your own sort of company that you run.
Well, I don't know, it's really just a name for my own freelance, yeah. But I work under Comus Creative. So if you go to Comus Creative, it's kind of under review, but at the moment comuscreative.co.uk should work, and you can see examples of some of the projects that I've been involved in. I was also last year, which is possibly also of interest, I travelled to Greenland to make a documentary, and that was like really fascinating to learn about how they, well, first of all, how directly and terrifyingly climate change is affecting their way of life in a very real and visible way, but also the way that they approach passing on their language and heritage to their young people gave me, like, you know, a very different perspective as well. So yeah, and just by the way, that Duchas, the feature-length film, which is about focused on the island of Bernery, but I think is symbolic of what's happening in many islands and has already happened in some islands. It's still on BBC iPlayer until the end of April if people want to watch it. And if you don't have access to the iPlayer, you can get in touch and I can try and work out a way for you to view it from wherever you are.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. And I think that is a great opportunity now to get into our discussion with some of the points that you made there, Kirsty. And I think, you know, it just jumped out that a simple phrase, pride of place, because that, you know, I'm sure like others have been thinking about if we spend so much time and effort making a case for the islands as being different and having their own culture and their own traditions and their own language, it's a bit off-putting to folk who might want to come and live and share that experience. However, if we think of pride of place, you don't actually have to be born in a place to be proud of it, than to be appreciative of its history and its culture and its heritage, and you know, to identify with it in that sense. Maybe not in a deep Dúchas type sense, but in an adopted sense nonetheless. So I think that might be a good place to get started, because pride of place, of course, can feed into the artistic world as well. So what I'd like us to do now is, there aren't a huge number of people. Oh yes, Kirsty, put your hand up.
So I was just going to point out what you're saying. I experienced with the Scotland's Rural Past project, whereby we had many community groups, archaeology community groups all over Scotland that we were helping. And a lot of the time they didn't, you know, they didn't originate from that place. They might have moved to that place, but it was an amazing way of just engaging them with the place and like talking about things like place names as we excavated or surveyed or whatever we were doing. You know, it was a really great way to engage them with their local history and help them to feel included in feeling that pride about where they lived. So I think Simon's got his hand up as well.
Yeah, just something that just occurred to me. I mean, archaeology as well as languages has a problem with engaging certain parts of the public. It's not widely, groups like Historic Scotland and English Heritage have trouble recruiting and attracting people from ethnic minorities and from the working class, frankly. It is very much a white middle class thing to go to archaeological sites. And particularly in regard to ethnic minorities, maybe there is a problem with the whole concept of heritage, this idea of an inheritance and sort of direct line of descent. Maybe that's actually even more the case with language. That if I mean, in terms of the future of Gaelic, to bring it back to that question, just restoring people who speak a bit of Gaelic and it's kind of fallen away isn't going to be enough. You're actually going to have to recruit people to the cause that actually have never spoken Gaelic and whose parents never spoke Gaelic, in the same way that archaeology has to attract people who've, you know, previously not shown an interest in archaeology. And I do wonder at the terminology of heritage itself as being perhaps part of the problem, that it is regarded as some sort of inheritance. So, whereas maybe we need to think of it as something that it's yours if you're interested in it. You know, this is not a blood right as such, but is something that is, you know, everybody can participate in and see value in.
Maybe predictably, I take a different view.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think, for example, you can't, if you understand the place names of the landscape, it gives you a much greater depth of perspective about what you're looking at in the first place. And so if you were to lose the understanding of the Gaelic names of the place, for example, you might as well be in the, you know, ups and downs because there's no relationship between people. You're just learning it from a book. So people actually move here with the intention of learning Gaelic or assimilating, or because they like the culture or like the culture of Shetland, for example, and they choose that by going there. And they don't have to adopt that as their culture, but I think we have to recognise that you can move into that and learn that culture and become part of that culture and contribute it in the same way as 1,000 years ago the Norse rocked up in the beaches and became embodied in that particular culture at the time, and that became part of the heritage. You know,
I think they probably came in a slightly different way to tourists.
well, yeah. I know, but I mean, so if you simply protect the language out of context, you're losing so much.
No, I'm not arguing that. I'm not arguing for protection out of context. I'm arguing that maybe getting people to see it as something that's relevant to them is part of the challenge for both archaeology and for language.
So that goes back to the question I was going to ask you about your own presentation, because that links it to me. I find it curious, and this is not a criticism. Well, it is actually, but it's not. It's not. I'm not sort of beating you a stick in it. In an age where we're all encouraged, I mean, you cannot write a research proposal now without actually stating out how you intend to disseminate your information and protect your resources and whatnot. How on earth can you do an archaeological project without actually building in, as part of the project, an interpretation of what they are to the people who come to the site? The amount of piles of old rocks that I've rolled up to, and people say, oh, you don't see much just now because there's no here. And there's no attempt to interpret it or explain what it is to anybody else. Isn't that a way that people can actually buy a way into the landscape and understand what's happening and maybe get it beyond the sort of white middle class club?
Absolutely. I mean, I agree that actually, if you excavate a site and you take public, particularly if you take public funding for excavating a site, you have an obligation not just to produce academic papers publishing results, but actually to disseminate that to the wider society. I don't think we disagree, actually. I think it's maybe just a question of terminology. I think what I'm arguing, though, is
you've covered over the site, and if you look at it, all you go there is you see a tarpaulin, a pile of tires.
They ticked all the right boxes, but the patient died. I think is the expression. But we've only been doing that relatively recently. It was absolutely normal for academics to just talk to other academics, to do research, and to have no sense of obligation to the great unwashed. You know, and we have seen a gradual widening of the audience. You know, at one time it was a very small literate and literary elite that talked amongst themselves. Obviously, university education has widened things somewhat in the last few decades. But now I think there is an obligation to go much wider than that and to explain it, to make it accessible in the parlance of the present day, you know, to people of, you know, limited education and potentially relatively limited interest. You know, you can break it down into relatively small size, digestible bits or whatever.
Simon, that's completely possible, because I'm going to go back to the example of the Nessa Brodgar, because they have just won a major award for the book that was written most recently about the site. But it's written by academics, it's written by professors and doctors and the people who are actually doing the site. But it's a populist book that can be read and understood by anybody. And it's been a bestseller in Orkney, obviously everything published in Orkney generally is, but it is possible. So it is treading a fine line, I do understand that, and not everybody can do that.
They're not presenting that site to the general public in the long term. They're going to rebury it.
Well,
that is
possibly.
the plan. Oh, not possibly. That's the plan. It will be in 10 years' time. It will be under a foot of soil.
I doubt it. 10 years' time, they'll still be digging.
Well, when they stop digging, they'll bury it again. That's the plan. That's the declared plan of the directors of the excavation.
Well, let's take us down another route. We'll stop archaeology just for the moment. And Keith, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, it's actually not unrelated to what, not so much the archaeology, but what the function of the original building was. And to think of that as a dwelling or as a space where people congregated. I go back to this congregation notion. There's something that Kirsty, just as you're drinking your cup of tea there, Kirsty, sorry. What I was really struck with in the film, and the film of the community of Bernary, a community that I know, there were a lot of people in the film that I didn't know were actually Gaelic speakers. They were young people who come back to the island, and I assume because they'd lived off the island that they had rediscovered their Gaelic, and that really struck me because I don't hear them talking Gaelic, and I know them really quite well. That struck me. The other thing that comes over very strongly, and it's one of the reasons that attracted me to the islands. When I was about 18, an Edinburgh guy, I went to call for about 5 years on the trot to work in a croft there. And every night we would go to someone's house to a céilí. And the céilí as a kind of verbal gathering of not so much the concept we think of, or others think of the céilí now as a place to dance, but that notion of gathering and that notion of sharing. And I felt, actually, and as an outsider coming in, I felt I was coming to something really precious, because I was coming to somewhere where I heard people talking, and the notion of, I got interested in the narratology of the events, the idea of stories being told, and stories I didn't understand the language, but I understood the passion of what they were, and I wanted to find out more. And that kind of led me into being a visual artist. And so, but I'm struck that in the film, there are many people who now talk about the fact that the culture of the céilí, going to the céilí, to people's house, doesn't happen now. And I certainly don't think it happens as it used to. And I wonder if we were to actually have a national policy of funding like the céilí, to actually, instead of money going to arts from Creative Scotland going to something, that you actually encourage something. I don't know how you do it. You buy a lot of cups of tea or whatever, but something that actually said, you will do this. Can you actually write that into communities with a view to actually the value of what the experience will be for the people there around language, around learning, about knowledge being shared, that, as you said, what was the intergenerational transmission. I think we've lost a lot of that, or have we?
Yes, there are ways. I mean, Keolis do that, for example. They have one night a week, and it's part of their funding. The way that they do it is that they get people to host a house céilí, and they provide them with funds to buy some refreshments, for guests, and so it's sort of an artificial way, but it still does sort of give a taste of what it used to be like. So again, it's never going to be like it was, but perhaps there are ways, perhaps there are creative ways that something can be done. But I think overall, as the general theme has been, national policy, I don't think is going to work, and we need to drastically address this, and it needs to be addressed fast. And if it doesn't come from kind of within the community, I don't know how it can work.
The people that are gathered here today, like yourself, Kirsty, we're mad keen on preserving or promoting or saving or developing our indigenous languages, and we're assuming that that's the main feeling in the communities themselves. Now, it's the feeling of some people in the community, but do we have any idea how common a feeling it actually is? And can we say that also, if people are not actually using their language, well, how committed to it are they?
Yeah, well, I can give you an example. Oh gosh, now, it was in about 2005 or 6, and the Western Isles Council released their Gaelic plan, which said that they were going to start up Gaelic medium schools. That was going to be their policy. And so I set about, I was at the time, I was on the vice chair of the National Board of Common and Parent, which is the committee for promoting Gaelic medium education and Gaelic for children. And so we set about trying to say, well, how about Carnish School, which is our local school, becoming a Gaelic school? I went and visited every single house with preschoolers in the whole of North Uist. We got money to make a feasibility study for a nursery, etc. Blah blah blah. Everything looked great. Came to public consultation, and it was an absolute, actually quite a traumatic experience for me personally, because there was visceral. There were some people who were just absolutely, completely against it. And I mean, Gaelic speakers, like some of my neighbours, completely against it, to the extent they started up a petition against it in the local shop. So, yeah, no, not everybody who speaks it sees it in the same way, certainly, that I did back then. In the end, the council on the back of the consultation, the council officers at the time recommended to the Education Committee of the council that overall the results of the public consultation were that the school should be made a Gaelic school, because there was only one kid, I think, who perhaps wasn't going to be enrolled in Gaelic medium education in the next 5 years, which is as far as you could predict. So that went to the Education Committee and they voted against it. And now there is no Gaelic school in North Uist. Well, in theory, there's a Gaelic school with an English unit, but anybody who knows anything about language acquisition knows that that can never work, and it doesn't. I mean, my nephews go there. Yeah, they speak Gaelic because of my family, but certainly the school concerts and everything do not put across that it's a Gaelic school with an English medium unit. It puts across that it's an English school with a Gaelic unit. So anyway, speaking very forthrightly there, but that's been my experience.
Yes, indeed. I fear that might be the case. Right. Okay. Well, let's see if we can get back to some of these other questions and also the comments in the chat. I don't know if people have been able to see that. There's been interesting comments. There's one from Vivica saying that the situation reminds her of the situation amongst the various Sami people in Scandinavia. I don't know, Vivica, if you'd like to say a word or two about that.
Yeah, it was when you, Kirsty, was saying about how do we avoid alienating those who feel a connection to their Gaelicness without actually speaking Gaelic. There are lots of Samis in Scandinavia, spread across Scandinavia, and they've not been treated well at all, and they're currently in Norway actively protesting against an infringement on their human rights, which was recognized by the Supreme Court. But over 500 days after that verdict, still nothing has happened. So things only happen when young activists, including Greta Thunberg, come and chain themselves to doors. Then things can happen. So these Samis here, many of them, and there are many different Sami groups, many of them don't speak Sami any longer. Because of Swedish, Norwegian, especially Swedish and Norwegian. Finland hasn't been quite as tough, having these monocultural education policies, but they are very much tied to their Saminess, their reindeer culture and their pride of place and their symbiosis with the land, which is why these various mines in Sweden and wind farms in Norway are a problem. So this would tie in with what they're no less Sami, but they no longer speak any of the Sami languages. There are different kinds of Sami languages. They're not mutually intelligible either, which is something that neither the Swedish nor the Norwegian powers could conceive of, that to the different Sami groups, that they were different languages. So that this whole usual way of colonial behavior that applies to these areas too. So there you see a macro population that spans over 3 countries, and they're tied together through this common sense of Sami-ness, even though each group is very individual and speaks a language that doesn't necessarily work in the next group, but they have a sense of Sami-ness that is very, very tied to the land, and the pride of place, which I too have, Andrew, I was writing that down on my own pad in capitals, and which really is very similar to the pride of place and Inuitness that you find not only throughout Greenland, but throughout Greenland and Canada. It's very similar, and the stories are very similar. It's, you know, the curse of living on resource-rich land, of course, as usual. So that's one of those points where it's important how you know, there could be well-meaning policies then that really wouldn't work in these areas, because there is not a single Sami language. There is a single Sami body that spans 3 nations, but there's not, and they all work with the assumption that this is a multilingual body that embodies Sami-ness, and they don't all speak Sami any longer. Some of them don't. Some of them haven't for 2 generations.
Thank you very much, Vivica. So islanders who don't speak Gaelic or Shetland or a Orcadian dialect. How to get back to Crocker's original point about language protection instead of language promotion? Do we have any thoughts out there? Any radical thoughts about how that could be brought about by 2050? Remember, we'll get this. Don't have to do it tomorrow, until 2050.
Well, can we get a clarification on what we mean by those 2 terms? Is protection?
Crocker is there, so I'm sure he'd be happy to give us his definitions.
Yeah, protection is basically about maintaining the culture of the linguistic minority as it exists. And then promotion is about creating the context for overall efforts, no matter if they're learners or the native speakers, while the manner in which they promote the linguistic heritage. So what we have at the minute is we have the promotion among school learners mostly, and then official language plans, but we have very little of the protection, the cultural asset of the existing speaker group. There's basically 0 strategic effort has been put into that aspect of the.
So it's primarily you're drawing a distinction between keeping the group that are currently speaking it and extending it into new users. But you might also, it's also partly about depth of knowledge of the language as well, I would imagine.
Yes, yeah. For example, you can't save a language. That's impossible. You can only help a group of people who possess the cultural capital of that language to survive, or from suffering their societal erosion as they're going through at the minute. But basically, the argument is the policy as we have nowadays is sufficient for Gaelic to be a school language. It's not really sufficient for anything else. And all the rest of the promotion efforts are basically a type of a camouflage to hide the reality of the social demise of the Gaelic group. So therefore, in a way, this is why I'm saying part of the effort we're putting into this is disguising the fundamental or the main social trajectory in Gaelic affairs, which is the erosion of the existing Gaelic group.
And clearly, Crocker, this is been the focus of your research, and you think about this, all the time. So you must have some recommendations up your sleeve that perhaps haven't.
We do. The easy answer to that, Andrew, is to read chapter 9 in the Gaelic crisis study, but that's way too simple. It's what we do there is we set out the community development model that leads to the social development of the language rather than the institutional development of the language. And there's been a debate about that. My reading of what's happened, if we can use the conference we had in August in Stornoway last year, as 100 people attended that, one of the biggest occasions on Gaelic affairs I've seen since I've arrived here. Generally, I would say that in the round, the vernacular group is accepting the diagnosis of their condition as set out in the book, and wants to see some type of debate, public debate, on new strategic collective efforts to deal with their situation in which they have some ownership over the issues. But then in official circles and in certain academic departments, they have been quite hostile. I don't think is too strong a word. They've been hostile towards the recommendations. So basically what that has done is it's made the community very wary about sticking their heads above the parapet in case they're going to get into struggle with Gaelic officialdom or the Gaelic middle class, basically, or the Gaelic academics. And I know that's controversial, but that's my take on what's happened. It's interesting that those involved in Gaelic official circles, they portray the book as controversial. No, we don't see it like that at all. We think the book is scientific, gives evidence, and it publishes data that the people can use, and we make recommendations based on the data. That is classical research. You study the issue, you give evidence, and you make suggestions. The temperature of the debate, I don't think has anything to do with the book. It's about something else completely. I think it's about people defending existing privilege that has emerged out of the approach we've had, the official Gaelic approach we've had today. This is why I think basically the official approach to Gaelic affairs in Scotland and in Ireland, it's basically clientelism. The most favoured clients, because they do very well financially and institutionally out of the official apparatus, therefore they defend it because they are defending their own class interest and their own privilege that system has given us. I would think at this stage, and this is a seminar, we're discussing ideas, and they can be brought forward as we have more meetings of this group. But I think for the Gaelic group, and I've studied these issues for over 20 years in the Irish vernacular situation as well, and I think we basically need 4 things. The first is that the Gaelic group in the islands, they need to be given some agency over their own context. So you can't get away from this. Unless they have agency in their context, there is no way somebody is going to solve their difficulties by a remote control process from the central belt. Society just doesn't work like that, basically. The second point I would make is that we need to make, and I've made this before earlier, we need to put some strategic effort into developing a community development model. There is community development in the islands, focus on local assets, land issues, so on and so forth. But I would humbly say that some of that is not focused on the collective coherence of the Gaelic group. In other words, that we need more focus on bringing coherence between all the efforts that the different Gaelic focus bodies are dealing with. A third point I would make is we need some type of risk management. So, for example, if the policy isn't going to be, or if the approach isn't going to be dynamic, effective enough, well, then we have to plan for risk. In other words, that the existing culture could disappear. If it does, and as we've stated in the book, under the current trajectory, the Gaelic social group, the vernacular group, will disappear. If they disappear, people will still have an interest in Gaelic affairs, Gaelic culture, Gaelic ethnography, and so on and so forth. They will ask two questions. What do these people sound like? In other words, what is the native phonology, grammar, lexicon, so on? And then what were their concerns? What did they talk about? So therefore, I think we should engage in, and we're doing some of this in the UHI anyhow, but we need much more effort and it needs to be more systematic. The work we're doing on Stores Bio Gael, we need a digital archive, as much recording as possible of the vernacular use of Gaelic over a wide range of domains, a wide range of social situations and social functions. In other words, if the culture, the living culture disappears, we have a digital archive of the last generation of the full speakers of that culture, the people who possess the cultural capital of that culture. The fourth thing we need to do is to integrate some of the engagement, setting aside the criticisms that we have of the approach at the minute. There are efforts at the minute, but we're not integrating them, this engagement. For example, the focus on schooling, the official approach to language promotion, the culture and heritage focus, the ethnographic focus that Tibor was talking about earlier, the place-based aesthetics. There are plenty of initiatives and plenty of money for aesthetic and cultural initiatives, but I would ask, where is the complementarity? Do efforts in one sector help out with people engaged with efforts in another sector? And the other question I would ask, where is the comprehensiveness in what we're doing? So, and you cannot have that unless you start with the two initial recommendations I had, that the community themselves need some agency over the issue, and then we need some strategic effort that is focused on giving some collective coherence to all these issues. So basically, local agency, strategic effort, risk management, and integration of efforts. These are what we need at the minute. Far superior to the naive aspects of the promotional endeavors that we have at the minute, I think. And not much more expensive than what we're doing at the minute. Bad language planning is equally as expensive as good language planning.
Thank you very much indeed, Crawford, and lots of nodding as I can see you across the screen. So thank you very much. That's all noted down. I see that Dawn has been trying to ask something or say something for a while. So. You're still on mute, Dawn.
Apologies, I've been having technical difficulties. Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Hello. Yes, I'm based in the north end of Skye, New England north end of Skye, and I'm been 36 years in the Highlands and working in education. So I've got a background in history, and then latterly across the whole of the West area as area education and learning manager in Highland Council, with a particular interest in Gaelic language and culture, and also being a fluent Doric speaker and a historian as well. But in terms of what we've been saying and what Kirsty was saying regarding intergenerational, I think what was just outlined was very, very, very positive, because I think one of the things that, in terms of linking to what Kirsty mentioned about Gaelic language planning, is that we've got a plethora of plans and not just in Gaelic language, but across lots of different agencies. And there needs to be a review of the planning and the purpose of the planning. And as Kirsty said, it's looking back to our heritage, and also looking at, as Simon Sinek says many times, we start with the why we're wanting to do this. And it does link very much to both the protection and promotion. And we've got an imbalance at present regarding protection and promotion. We can see that the promotion has been highly successful, especially in the Central Belt, but to almost the detriment of the more indigenous areas, where there's been serious issues of recruitment and retention of teachers because of the successes in the Central Belt. So that has caused major challenges. And I think that in terms of what the last speaker, and apologies for not knowing the pronunciation, I think what was outlined as a kind of way forward is definitely one of the ways that I would be envisaging that we do move forward. We need to have a review of the strategic way forward, which has to look at the protection. And one of the ways that we have to look at the protection is for us, and as Kirsty well knows, that we've got particular local areas where there are strong intergenerational and strong culture, music, and different things happening, which has an indirect or a direct contribution to the schooling. For instance, we've got the highly successful Clan Trotternish and some of the related groups and Gaelic groups and agencies in the north end of Skye, which have to be, in a sense, looked at. And we've got the same in different areas across the islands in terms of areas where there's good practice happening. And I think one of the things that the previous speaker mentioned as well is the lack of connectivity across all these different areas. We need to have a strategic overview. We need to look at the balance between protection and promotion, but we need to look at the local areas. Now, it's not just the agents, well, it is the agency in the local areas, but it's how we actually promote and distribute the funding just now, because we know that the funding goes out to different groups and organizations, but the criteria for that funding could be questioned, and we need to look at that, being able to put that into the local areas, have organizations and groupings within the local areas who can get, therefore, as we've mentioned, the agency in order to promote the good practice, to support whether it's music, drama, culture, history, in order to integrate that. And this has led to successes in areas like the north of Skye in order to do that. And it also, that links very much with the language acquisition, so that the language is not just the language of the school, it becomes more the language of the community and the wider community. I've got a number of close relatives who've gone through Gaelic medium on Skye, in North End of Skye, through the Gaelic medium there, but also in Inverness and Tain. And one of the reasons why all those relatives have got fluency, the major contribution to that has been the family and the community around supporting that language acquisition and fluency. And I think that also we need to develop that further. So look at the intergenerational and how we can get things. And some of this is going back to some of the things which were in the past quite the norm in terms of the village halls, the village communities, groups visiting, the meeting place, that whether you call that the terminology of the Ceilidh. And I know myself, for instance, that in Commure, there's been a big resurgence in Commure around the village hall, opportunities, music, arts, getting the youngsters together, getting the community together in different types of events, which is all one way or another supporting and promoting the language and culture and the heritage. So that's what I like to see it moving forward. But we need the strategic lead in order to do this and get away from the idea of challenging getting away from the idea of there's only one way to do things. It's great that we're getting the promotion is working. We're getting more and more people learning language, whether it's through Duolingo or whether it's through the numbers going up in the nursery and in the primary school. And we know that obviously the challenge is moving into secondary. But however, we need to ensure that the indigenous local communities where the language is alive, we need to be able to, one way or another, encourage the promotion of that, but also we need to share that practice. And by sharing that practice, we'll learn from that process. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Don. Thanks for sharing your experience there and for telling us about the situation in the north of Skye. And well, I think we've talked about the language quite a bit, but obviously we could talk a lot more. But there's some other things I just would like to bring up. First of all, I'd like to hear what the role the creative industries might have, just briefly, about using heritage and culture in the next decade or so. But also, before we watch Shenethus and question Frank about his film, I just wondered, what do people think success would look like in 2050? Would it be having 100,000 people living in the Outer Hebrides monolingual English speakers, or would it be 20,000 fluent Gaelic speakers living there? Similarly, in Shetland and Orkney, is it a large population living sort of high quality economic lives without culture, without any connection to the local culture and traditions, or is it not? What do people actually feel? Because a lot of when we talk about sustainability, we're talking about just numbers of having people and jobs and things like that without necessarily considering other aspects. But what do you feel would success be in 2050? But before that, that's the second question. If I'd just like Shuan and Keith maybe to say something about the creative industries' role in all this.
You see, I personally don't like the word creative industries. Let's just start with that. I don't, the word industry, I don't think people who work in creative practice or creative makers or creative thinkers, you know, industry suggests something else.
It's the prioritization of the commercial, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and that's the thing which is actually dangerous here. And there are a lot of people. I don't know if a colleague from Isle of Man is still here, but there's a really important artist from Isle of Man, internationally acclaimed, Kevin Atherton. And Kevin, I actually was talking to Kevin about this event, and both his grandparents, both sets of grandparents were Manx speakers. He remembers them speaking Manx, and he said that one of the greatest problems with arts is that arts constantly change. You know, artists are constantly doing things which are about doing something new. And in fact, what happened with modernism, which started at the end of the last century, modernism kind of took what had been the accepted notions of what the academies were, etc., and turned it all upside down. Duchampian views, whatever you want to call them, the whole world turned upside down with modernism. And that's actually not necessarily good for language in terms of linguistics, language. It's good for art. But so I'm a bit kind of wary about how, where I think we kind of got to democratize this is down to the kind of creativity of experience that I mentioned at ISO on call, where I went to someone's house and someone sang a song, which I didn't expect them to sing. And they sang a song beautifully that I've never heard before. And then it turned to someone else who told a story. And it turned to someone else who did something. And there was no sense of this is high art, or it was actually it was a kind of creative practice, came from the soul. And so that's what I'm actually really interested in, even though I've worked with artists and I've exhibited, I'm actually interested in the root of that. And I think the root of that is actually part of the problem, because I think that's gone from, that notion of creativity has gone out. It's partly gone through education, which I think education's, you know, we've actually, there's been a real issue about how we enable talent to develop. We live within an institution. We're all connected, or have been connected to institutions, and we know that at the end of the day, someone's going to get a bit of paper, and they'll do anything to get to the top grade. But sometimes that creativity is actually the process of getting it. So I'm worried about that. Genuinely worried about that. So I go back to that thing about the democratization of creativity. Get rid of our creative industries. That was a Labour invention. Get back to, you know, at the heart of what excites someone, and making a contribution. And I think actually that if you want to know what I feel about it, it goes like everything else. We watch the X Factor and these programs, and there's one word where someone can stand who's got talent, but they might not have confidence. And I think installing confidence is really important, and enabling people to actually step forward and learn and feel that pride of language. But the fact that actually around language, there's also all these other kind of cultural, you know, activities, music, dance, da da da. But I just feel that's it. So let's about creative practice and encourage people. They've got a great thing in Finland that I used to like going to Finland. That in every community there's a thing called a little art school, and the little art school happened at the end of the school day, and it happened during winter. So the kids would then go into the space where someone would teach them how to sew, how to knit, someone would play a piece of music, someone would teach how to paint. And they were given a lot of freedom to do what they wanted. And the confidence that came out of that, Nokia actually picked up on this and would put some of their staff into kind of these little art schools. And I just wonder if that's the kind of thing that could be funded, where there's, you know,
what about the fashion? The fashion for music,
yeah,
certainly. That's one of the most exciting, innovative, productive, creative activities out relating to music, where there are literally tens of thousands of children that have come through learning how to play instruments of various sorts, many of whom have gone on to actually tutor or go into bands and make recordings and so on and so forth. It's back to your commercialisation, but the big part about it is just what you put your finger on there is the confidence that's instilled in children of all ages to get up and actually perform in public.
But that's so the music, if we can transfer that energy and to other things. But think of other creative practices, including language. So there's actually a sense that there's a holistic experience of the culture, and it's not just about one little kind of. That goes back to, I think, what we didn't do in the past, but that's what we do within an educational system. We separate. Okay, there you go off, and there's your, and this at this period you're doing art, this period you're doing maths. But that holistic kind of learning, I think, is something which I think we could do. And I actually think we could actually create spaces for it. We could create a space like this in every community. It just sort of says, and they do exist. I've seen them. But that little art school concept that's funded, I think actually works really well here. And we don't want anyone else having it. We'd want it here. You know, we could work in the islands. Yeah. That's where the islands deal should have been doing things like that. Yeah. That's where the island deals funding. The Keolis is obviously a good example of, but that Keolis and Crocs Ollie weren't actually part of the islands deal funding, but it went in there.
And again, there's some really good. I mean, the Gaelic Arts Agency, you know, Budget in Ireland did that for years. It was extremely successful until its funding was actually damaged, and the whole thing just fell apart.
Well, I'm sure that Shun would actually talk the same about the value of, and I know that this happens in the Western Isles. In fact, they just contributed an event that happened in Canada, but the notion of the knitting group. The knitting group, you know, the knitting group we've got in North Uist has become this really radical kind of group of people getting together, testing it and sharing knowledge. But that's a really good example as well, Shun.
Totally agree about that democratization bit and recognizing forms of creativity that don't immediately neatly fit into what we think of as the creative industries. And it would be lovely if by 2050 we never had to mention the term creative industries again. That would be fantastic. I was remembering quite recently we were consulting some people in Shetland about a future public art project, and there was a young artist who was saying that when she saw opportunities for people to apply to be professional artists in Shetland, that she felt, and she had sometimes been told that she didn't have the professional experience in order to apply for these things, and she was asking, so where do I get that? Is it the local arts agency's responsibility to be making it possible to get professional experience for young artists here? And if visiting artists are employed to deliver professional contracts doing creative things, should part of that contract not be providing professional experiences to some of the artists and creative people who are here, rather than those people being sometimes treated as resources for visiting practitioners and researchers, sort of providing their knowledge and expertise, which is seen as somehow naturally occurring and not really a skill. And it might be an advantage if there was attempts to make a more level playing field in terms of what's seen as being professionally valid.
Thank you very much, Siwan. And we've got our own little University of the Arctic Yarns and Yarns knitting group, haven't we? That you were involved in, the last one. So we're spreading our wings across the Atlantic. Thank you very much. So we've got one suggestion for 2050. No more use of the term creative industries. Simon said on, well, you can take yourself, Simon. What was it?
Sorry, is this for the what would
what would success look like?
What did I say?
You said, yeah.
Yeah, so a community of practitioners that was comfortable in itself and welcoming of newcomers. Survival isn't enough. Sorry, rather glib. Sorry about that.
No, it's nicely put. Nicely put. Let's see, Kirsty talking about the FAISH movement being transformative experience. Yeah, and I think it was for my niece as well, who's now gone on to university to learn primary school teaching through the medium of Gaelic. So the FAISH were important for her. What else we've got? Some very useful notes there from Crocker, so make sure and we'll save the chat. Thank you very much. That's excellent. And Don's got his hand up.
Yes, thanks. I would very much reiterate regarding the way that we can facilitate organisations like the FAISH. It's been very, very successful in Highland, and at times when we've had major difficulties with teacher recruitment, the FAISH has been supporting, in particular, primary schools and the development of the curriculum. And I think it goes back to what Conker mentioned earlier about agency, in the fact that we've got these different groups which are very, very productive and very, very helpful, and that we need to be able to utilise these properly. These are not add-ons, and too often they're thought of as being an add-on and one of the easiest ways to hit for funding. But in actual fact, whether we're talking about FAISH, where we're talking about Gaelic arts and drama groups and such, the money should be focusing on these groups in order for them to be connected with education more formally in order to support language development and acquisition. And this would be money very well invested. And that's where we need to look at the as Conker mentioned as well, about the strategic overview. And part of the strategic overview is looking at where the funding goes and how the funding goes to different groups and organisations, and how the impact of that funding is measured as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Absolutely. Well, we've really just reached the end of this bit. It's very fascinating discussion. But I'd quite like to hear from Vivica what she sees success in Shetland in 2050 might be like.
I would like to see Shetland on the census for one. I would like to get languages onto the census that aren't on the census now to see what we get. Try it and experiment, try and see. I would like to see MA theses and PhD theses in Shetland. I'd like to see information sheets and so on in Shetland, that kind of thing. I'd like to see more L2 material. Well, I'd like to see L2 material in Shetland because there is not really any. Because like Simon says, it's only really, and we've seen that typologically, if we look at the global patterns, when a language is not only, you know, the transmission, intergenerational transmission is the yardstick. When you stop transmitting to the next generation, that's when the language is endangered and eventually moribund and will die when the last speaker dies. But one way of transmitting it is also to teach it, and to have L2 material. That in turn means you accept people at different levels of proficiency, because no one will go from 0 to absolutely fluent. So it should be okay for learners of Shetland to have an accent, just like you know, any learner of Swedish will have an accent until they're fluent. So these kinds of things are also, that's an attitudinal thing that needs to be built into all this. It's okay to be a language learner that doesn't speak it fluently, because you're at an interlanguage state, and you can only get to the fluency through these stages. So I'd like to see essentially pretty much, I'd like it to not have to motivate why Shetland should be just everywhere. A bit like with you, where you were told that your data was controversial, and you said, well, we didn't see it that way, we're just presenting the data. I've kind of encountered the same issue here. I'm presenting the data as I see it, and that suddenly gives unexpected results, and therefore you get knee-jerk reactions. Well, I'd like to see Shetland be treated as any other boring language. You pay your bills in it, you write your homework in it, you write pieces to the Shetland News in it, you argue about fence posts as well as sustainability. You know, I'd like to see Shetland used in the same way as any other language is used in its society.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vivica. I love the imagery there. Right. Okay. Well, wonderful stuff. I'm going to now look for Frank's video on YouTube, and we will. So, well, thank you very much, Frank, for letting us see that lovely film about Gaussian. I'm sure some people will have some questions about that. I certainly have one or two.
But your own contribution.
Yeah, who was that guy in the short? How many people live in Gaussian today, and what's the state of Gaelic like in the community?
Well, it depends, and there are three villages within Galston. Within it, there's north, south, and Melba's Galston. And between that, there'll be about maybe nearly just over 200 people, 250 people within the villages. Gaelic is very healthy. Not everyone speaks it, of course, because there are many people who moved into the village. You know, there are people from, we have several English families, Icelander, Canadian, American who have moved in, that's married in the village and so on. So there's a whole range of people within there, but it's still a working language in the community. And so, you know, and in my household, it's the first language within the area, and all my neighbours right about would be their first language too. So Gaelic is still very, very active.
Excellent. That's excellent news. I was going to ask you what you'd learned from making the film, but I'll leave you with that because I can see that Kirsty got her hand up. So,
I just wanted Frank to say Mealor Neach, Fashen Tidach Scanial Mirvelach Agus. Just that was fantastic. And on a sort of personal note, it was quite emotional for me because it brought to mind how privileged I was in my childhood to have learnt about many of the things that you cover in that film from my Auntie Annie, who was a friend of yours, and it just felt, watching it, like yeah, from start to finish, it felt like I was hearing her voice coming through, and so just thank you. That was fantastic.
I should say the film we saw just now, you can see it stuttering a bit in different places. That doesn't happen when you see it. It's a function of the projector linking up with the computer apparently. So you can compensate for it if you know what to do, but I don't. But when it was shown in the cinema, then obviously we ironed it out, and it's just like a smooth feature film. There's no stuttering. So I just wanted to reassure you of the workmanship. But one of the things I found in that really was, I don't mean to be dismissive, but how easy it was to make a really, really high quality, high resolution film with a camera, and the sound. The interviews weren't done, as you all remember, it were just done on the iPhone. We're just done on the phone here on a tripod, sticking in front of somebody, and using a free app called Recording Pro. You can do these things at broadcast quality. The real skill, of course, is stitching it all together. And for that, I was able to browbeat my daughter, who is a graphic designer, to actually edit the whole thing together in one place. And that is the real critical part of it, to make sure that you actually obviously sync the words with the activities and so on. But relatively, I was quite apprehensive before I started, because I've never done anything before or did since. Doing that just at the end of last year, the end of October, November last year. But it is relatively straightforward, and I wouldn't hesitate to do it again on a different topic as it goes through.
Just kind of one more thing, and the little the button that you found at the Kersh the Croag and Balasher. So Auntie Annie was the one who took me around and taught me about archaeology at a young age. And when I was 10, I found a coin that dated to 810. That was again, my dad was like, "Oh, throw it away. It's an old Red Cross button." But Auntie Annie persuaded me to send it into Treasure Trove, and right enough, it was King Eanred of Northumberland. And at that point, it was one of the earliest pieces of evidence to show trading with the Vikings in US. So similar kind of, just
And there are many, there are many things like that here. There's a Roger King Edgar, and there's numerous skeletons and various artifacts that are found when as it goes through. I never miss a chance to tell Agnes, my wife, that we're walking on the shore when I found that, and I found it. I went, "Oh, look at this!" And she said, "That's probably something from Woolies that's been thrown away." And I said, "I don't think so. I don't think so." And cleared it off, and it was something really rather special. So yeah, they're all around if you know where to look.
Have you kept a sort of note of where you found it? Because it could well be, as you mentioned, from a grave.
Absolutely, precisely know where it came from. And after every big storm, I walk past again, and it's been in the museum just across the road from us here in the college here on permanent display since the mid-80s. So it's quite something to see.
I'd reiterate what Andrew was saying. Almost no stray finds are stray finds.
Right.
They're actually nearly always from settlements or graves or something like that. It's just that it's the first thing we found.
Yeah.
Or we haven't accurately mapped where it really came from.
Yeah. No, I will keep an eye.
Excellent. Well, if you find more, let us know. Now we've got Don's got his hand up.
Many thanks for sharing. That was really excellent, and linking with what I mentioned previously, there's a great opportunities to look at what was shared in the format in terms of obviously both the audiovisual, but also in the terms of looking at from an educational perspective and an intergenerational perspective of looking at building interdisciplinary learning projects in different areas around the topics that we've been talking about. So we are looking at whether it be the geology, the long-term history, the culture, the language, settlement, resettlement, clearance and such, and being able to replicate that across different areas and share in order to promote understanding for protection, but also to promote it for long-term learning and promote intergenerational working. And I think there's great opportunities to do that. I remember in Highland Council going back probably 30 odd years or so ago, there was a huge project done centrally to gather together information across the different areas on a range of different topics going back in history. And I think there's opportunity in a sense. The time is of the essence in order to, in a sense, look at potential funding around some of these projects and building a long-term legacy, because we could easily build templates around that, around the different curricular areas, which could readily be supported via Education Scotland, but also by schools and local groups and local Gaelic groups. So many thanks for sharing. It was very impressive.
Thank you. That was very much uppermost in my mind when I was doing that. You'll notice that all of the accents are local accents. It was my attempt to sort of redress the balance of the Ben Fogel saga, where he appears on a remote island and goes to a remote beach on the remote island, and and then he's away again before you've actually got into any depth of the place. So I wanted to get local, true voices of the place to go and see what they're going to have to try. And as you say, it's just the beginning of the beginning of just scratching that thing. You can actually imagine something on an interactive website that links to that and just adds and builds and adds and adds and adds and put other stories on as well in English and in Gaelic and what else. So yeah, very much the sort. It was funded by the Year of Scotland's Stories, which was the intention for that, and Lantern approached me to do something that would be reflective of the community rather than sort of a view from a faraway city of. And one of my passions, Don, is that I don't live on Lewis. I live in Lewis, and it's not on the rock. It's in a community. And so I never fail to correct people when they say, "Do you live on Lewis?" No, I don't.
I was wondering, having made the film, was there any new inspirations or new thoughts that the film generated?
The film has generated, as has the book that went before. The book came out in 2020, and I am even literally just a few weeks ago. I get stories filtering through regularly by people who've read it, and that they either have a part to contribute to it, or another version of a story, or something to add to it, or several people who've said that they felt inspired to go and look at their own community now and their own villages as it goes through. So very much it's about adding, information behind that. There's a story in the book, for example, about one of the village boat that was lost. They thought it was lost at sea, but in fact they were kidnapped by pirates and sold to a plantation in the Caribbean. And one of the people escaped and managed to get home to find his wife had remarried and his children were not. So he left again. And so I told that story. There are still descendants within the West Side community who know that story. And I got an email out the blue from a lady who was in the south of England who read it, and she said she was electrified by the story because one of the people who didn't come back was a relation of hers, and it's the first time she's seen these things written down. So there are still stories coming out the woodwork which would never have appeared had not the book and then the film itself, triggered those people to get in touch and tell these stories. So yeah, I'm hoping there'll be much more.
Fantastic. And have you got another film planned yourself?
Not in the I'm still licking my scars from this one. Yeah, no, it was very, very interesting to try and do it and to put the thing together, and learned a lot of lessons from that in doing so. But the technique is relatively easy. What I'm looking at now is actually working with the Urus, working with the Galsam Trust, the community trust, to look at creating some thematic heritage information about our area, whether it's in geology or in archaeology, birds or whatever else as it goes through this. So that's the project for the summer. Definitely.
Sounds great. Do we have any other questions or comments for Frank?
I have a comment. It's an observation. It's something which the nature of UCI, playing at UCI for a few years, having the privilege of going to different islands, and seeing different communities and meeting colleagues. It's great seeing colleagues again. And especially after COVID, you know, because we lived in this world, but to physically go to these islands, and you invited comments from people and colleagues about their experience of their place. What did you think is the difference between Orkney, Shetland, and the Western Isles? I've heard people, you know, I'll give you an example. The guy who was leading on the islands deal, I once asked him, what's the difference between Shetland and Orkney? And he says, well, the Shetlanders are all about money. And he says, they're really good at making money. And he said, they just know how their economy drives. And it's started with fishing. And he said, Orcadians, farmers. They're farmers. And it comes from farming. And yet they've got this archaeology, which is, and I'm not going to repeat what he said about the Western Isles. He actually just went silent. Just a silence. But I'm wondering what you're having had that experience and that, you know, that privilege of going to 3 fantastic places. What do you think? What's the difference between?
Well, to me, I always begin with the geology because that's my sort of visceral feeling in it. And the geology for me has a direct sort of flow chart between the geology, the landscape, the geomorphology, the land use, the people, the culture of it. So it's all a big chain as it goes through, and you can relate one to the other. You can see quite easily Orkney is flatter and different soil and much richer farming area and whatnot. Shetland is geology is not unlike Lewis, not exactly similar, but not unlike it as well, but quite different from Orkney. Much more similar to here, but then when you look at Shetland compared to here, again you see these differences, and you know there's much more voe, which is why we say Shetlanders are is a fisherman with a croft, whereas in Lewis you find a Lewisman as a crofter with a boat, you know. So it's very much the perspective, which end of the telescope you're looking down. Yeah. But yeah, to me it's the physical immersion in the physical landscape that's the it triggers everything. That's the key point to link everything through, and that's reflected, and it's reflected in the place names as well, and the Gaelic descriptive names of the place as you walk through. If you know, I have a sort of pet theory, and I talk about it in the book there. It's a bit like Bruce Chapman's songlines. You know, singing his way across Australia with the Aboriginal songlines that describes the communities. If you understand the Gaelic, you can actually walk through the landscape and navigate without having been there, because this is called Ben Jarrag, which is the Red Hill, and this one's called Poldu, which is the deep, the black pool, the dark pool, and so on. So you can navigate through the landscape without actually having been there in the first instance, because it's a descriptive terminology of place, and the colours and the shapes and the land features and whatnot. So that's very much a visceral part for them. They can't. That's why I say I can't separate that from the landscape.
It's not unlike Welsh in that respect. So you've probably all heard, but I would bet none of you can say Llanfair Pwllgwyn Gylchgo Gerrig Llwyn Drobodd Llantysilio Gogorgoch, which is the longest place name in Wales, but it's actually directions. It's not a name. I can't remember the exact translation, but it's something like you need to go past the little church of St. Mary, past the whirlpool, through the something or other to get to the, and that's the place name. So,
What's practice?
Yeah.
I charge about £10 an hour for lessons, and usually make about 400 or 500 quid per person. Yeah.
I see Kirsty's put on the chat similarity between Unst and Uist. So. All right. Well, if there are any more questions or comments, now's your chance. Otherwise, I think we'll bring this afternoon to an end. And thank you, everybody, for your contributions. I found it very interesting indeed. I don't think we've perhaps come up with recommendations particularly about the future, apart from the fact that pride of place is extremely important, and that's something that both people who are indigenous to a place and those who've come in can both share. And there's a role for the creative practitioners in this to produce materials that engage and excite us. So perhaps if you have other recommendations that you'd like to share, then email them to me, and I'll see what I can do. But thank you very much indeed. And we have another one of these workshops based in Orkney on the 21st of April, which will be looking more at sustainable energy and power generation. So that seems sensible to be in Orkney for that. So if you'd like to take part in that workshop as well, let me know. And in the future, we'll also have a virtual conference where we can pick up on some of these questions. So if people would like to take part in that, please let me know as well. And with that, enjoy your weekend. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne.
Yes, thank you, Leanne.
Thanks, Leanne.